the host maybe.
Oh yeah, because earlier I have the audio problem, so I worry about I cannot kick out meeting on time. So that's why I connect the grant Sergey, the host, and then just rejoin, just disconnect it. Yeah. But I kill. Oh, sorry, I already record. Go ahead, Derek.
No, it's fine. I was just, I guess it's the September 28th SIG Node meeting. We have a few items on the agenda. Some I'm not sure we'll get to full resolution on today, but at least we can get awareness. I guess, Sergey, would you be kind enough to want to run through today's agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everybody. I think we can start as usual with some formal reduction. Like if you missed last 2 weeks and don't know what was happening in terms of PRs and work happening, you can click all those links on the created PRs and closed merged PRs. I went through that. Like there is no nothing wrote in a way that needs to be picked up, and we're doing a very good job in updating PRs, like replying to PRs. Like 146 is unusually high number, so we're doing great. So yeah, and I wanted also to remind everybody that soft code freeze we announced before is in 2 weeks, and one of those weeks is KubeCon week. So that would be nice if you're running a cap and you have your PR out at least by October 15, so we have time to review and go through all the necessary steps to merge the PR. So now is there? Yeah.
For the soft code freeze, I think I sent an email about this, so you should have it in your inbox. It's on the SIG Node mailing list. I just wanted to add, this is the first time we've done this. We were hoping to try to get like some features merged earlier. I know that everybody is very busy, but certainly like one thing we really want to avoid is everybody not having their PRs ready until like the last week of code freeze, given how long the development cycle is. So even if we don't get everything that we want to get merged by then, like we've got a bunch of beta things that would be cool to graduate by that point, but please have a PR ready for review by that point, so we don't spend all of like the last week of code freeze just doing that. Also, I suspect that 148 updated might have been somewhat my fault, since I got through a very long GitHub backlog this week. Do we want to go on to the agenda, Sergey?
Yeah, okay, let's go into agenda, and I think first is Skylar, enable static pods. Are you on the call?
She doesn't seem to be on. Basically, she's implemented the pinned images PR, where like in CRI, you can have specify an image is pinned and kubelet does not try to GC it. So she wanted to quickly check whether we can get it in or we need to open an enhancement for that.
So we had a cap that's already merged for this. So that's what is it really just we're trying to, is that the issue, or we just need to make sure that we do the review?
I believe we want to enable this expanded scope to all the static pod. He or she, I don't know, and didn't make that clear, but from the agenda, and it looks like they want to expand it. I think that we do have concern on those things. We talked about last time when we discussed the pinned image. But it's, once we expand it to static pod, then we may have to consider more things, right? So when the local disk, it is out of disk, and all the pod is the static pod, what we should do. And also there's the different use cases in the community. People using static pod, but the upgrade. So if that's the static pod, are we going to think about the current state? What kind of the static pod, which version, even like the same pod, but different image version, which one should be evicted, which one shouldn't be evicted? All those kind of complexities should be considered here.
Yes,
So
that's good feedback, Don. I guess what I was trying to figure out was the linked cap off the PR, which was 2694. basically the runtime decides which images were pinned. And I thought the PR that was presented just had implemented that. Is there a place where this was tied back to static pods?
Agenda. From the agenda, actually ask, can we enable static pod for this one? And do we need to open an enhancement for this one? I do think about we should enhancement that's more complicated than the current really small pin image we discussed. Even that time, actually, we did mention that.
Okay, I was going to go through the PR. I just didn't see anything that was unique to static pods. So that's why I was confused.
Yeah,
Yes.
I missed that one as well. Yeah.
I also go through that PR. I think PR should be high, most okay, but but I do have concern about the people maybe abuse that one. Then we end up have like not by the node. We don't know how to recover, right? So today's we just force delete because once we have run out of the disk. So, and what's the rescue for if we have those kind of problems? So this is why we need to discuss. Anyway, I will comment on this this request since she cannot attend and ask the enhancement request.
So we have action items on that. And I'm a little bit surprised that it was added into existing cap. So is it only CRI, like Ronald, do you know if it's only
I think
CRI v1 or it's backported to current version of CRI as well?
so. I think when we first discussed this, it was only the scope was smaller, like the way it is implemented in the KEP, and I think I missed the middle discussion around static pods. So I'll have to catch up on that.
Yeah, I just don't even see anything on the PR that is tied to static pods. So the PR, when I looked at it, was basically saying preserve the image if it's been pinned, which inherently does mean that you're giving higher priority to any pod that is consuming that image or could consume that image. But either way, obviously the speaker isn't here to give us more insight.
I am here.
Oh, yeah, I think Skylar just joined.
I just showed up. Sorry, I'm very late.
Yeah, so Skylar, I guess we were trying to understand what the relationship was to static pods with the item you put on the agenda.
So basically what was going on is that I had made a pull request that created, like it enabled for pods to be pinned in order for them not to be removed at garbage collection. And there wasn't, give me half a second. So we needed it to be like probably to be put through the process of like adding a feature because pinning the pods is a feature, and that's the plan.
Apologies, but I thought the PR that was linked is just pinning the images, not the pod.
Oh yeah, sorry, the images.
And the KEP that is linked off that PR had been merged, which let the CRI say that this image is pinned.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess my first feeling is I look at the PR, but the PR looks to implement what we had proposed in the KEP. So I was just trying to understand what the delta is, or if the ask is that we do something different.
No, I think the ask was just to see if like the process is being followed correctly for this PR, and we don't need to like attach it to some other KEP thing or anything. So
Does the KEP have mention in terms of like how you want to handle this for static pods currently and all of the API changes?
Alana, I guess maybe, or someone could help clarify, is why does static pods matter at all? This is just saying don't garbage collection image if it's been pinned.
Yeah, that's also what I'm trying to understand. Like,
yeah, because there might not even be a pod on,
Yeah.
at present on that disk that's using that image, but the deployer presumably has asked that that image always be present on the node.
Skylar, can you clarify? Because the PR in question that's linked has nothing to do with static pods, but the agenda item says enable static pods.
Maybe I wrote it totally wrong. Because I'm going from advice that Mernal gave me about bringing this up at this meeting. So I probably totally messed up how to write it.
Maybe it was meant to be enable static images.
Yeah, probably.
That makes sense.
I want to this one, like what Derek earlier mentioned, that we already discussed that pinned image in the past, and at that time already static pod is being brought up. So let's just forget about static pod. Make this is the narrow scope what we agree. If we go static pod, we need a more complicated policy. So let's just make sure we are just layered up. For the PR, I did look at the PR. I also didn't see that expanded. So let's just make it clear. Say if we want the static pod support, come up with a new policy and the enhancement cannot piggyback a previous CAP, right? But
Yeah.
so far I think PR actually is aligned with the CAP.
I think if this is just a typo, from what I can see, the thing that's being proposed here has already been merged to the CAP. So I think that's fine. I don't think there's a new CAP needed or anything like that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my bad. Sorry.
Don't worry. We
Okay,
just want to make it clear we are aligned. Yeah.
Okay, then let's go on. There was a striking item about dynamic kubelet config. I replied in a comment or mentioned, I think Paka cannot be here, that's why it's striking over. So reminder, if you are affected by dynamic kubelet config and you have a strong case to not delete it in 124, please step forward.
I linked to the comment as well that caused this to be crossed out.
Thank you. Adrian, checkpoint restore.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that it's ready for further review approval. I think we from Ronald and I are at a point where we think it's ready. We trimmed it down to just to the core use case and try to remove everything which is not directly related to the CAP.
Yes, I saw that. I also see your message, and Tao and I is going to review, and we are going to be the reviewer and also approver on this one.
Okay.
Thanks.
That's already, yes. Thank you.
So this is for 124, right? I just want to make sure that everybody understands it's not coming in 123.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this will be for 124.
Yep. Yeah. Jordan, do you want to talk about PDB and eviction?
Sure. So I started a thread on the mailing list this morning. I also included SIG apps and put this topic on the SIG apps the next meeting because it sort of touches apps and touches Node. And then I tried to link to some of the issues and discussions and stuff that's going on here. But the short version is eviction currently sometimes prevents eviction of pods that are not ready, and sometimes does not. And sometimes preventing a not ready pod from being evicted will make it impossible to drain a node which there's an open bug for. So at least some people are negatively impacted by that and expect eviction to not have opinions about pods that aren't ready. But other people are relying on eviction blocking deletion of not ready pods for other reasons. So I think Michael mentioned that in the pull request and in the thread. So this has come up before, and it's kind of been unclear what the behavior should be. And there's been a variety of adjustments made to what eviction allows over time to allow deleting pods that are already in a terminal state, no matter what the PDB says, or allow deleting pods that haven't been scheduled to a node yet, regardless of what the PDB says. And recently, like a year ago, allowing deleting a not ready pod if the PDB status says there are enough healthy pods. And so there's a mismatch between what the API server allows and what the disruption controller considers to be a healthy pod. And I think what we have today doesn't really make sense, and I'd like to try to figure out how to resolve this. So the questions that I asked in the SIG Node thread, there were three questions. One was, is a pod that's not ready considered to already be disrupted? The second question was, does it make sense for eviction to block deletion of pods that are already disrupted? And then the third question was trying to get feedback on people who were relying on the current behavior and how they were handling some of the races and lack of guarantees around the current behavior.
So Jordan, one question I had was in some of the dialogue on the issue, there was special behavior documented around how you can prevent any voluntary disruption by setting, I guess, the PDB to 0. Is there any express desire to change that behavior, or is that independent of the PR that was linked?
I don't think there's a desire to change that behavior. I think the question is what counts as disruption? And so that was my first question. Like, if a pod is not ready, is it already disrupted?
Yeah, so I will admit that some of my confusion this morning when trying to speak to both David and Michael on the topic was some of the confusion in terminology we sometimes use. So ready versus available, and the PDB referring to available, where available only had meaning on replica sets, but not on pods themselves. But yeah. I think the definition of ready implying I'm already disrupted or not is a good way to clarify the question. What I was trying to figure out was if there's an unspoken use case desired for don't disrupt the scheduled non-terminal pod. And that's what I feel like is coming up in the existing dialogue on the issue. And so to me, I wondered if the API is as documented or if the API is as implemented. And do we want to only tighten API behavior when the as implemented behavior can still be restored with maybe an as yet undefined knob? And so that's what I was trying to figure out. But I didn't reach my own mental closure on this. I also wondered if, well, yeah, I guess I'll pause there. Does that make sense though, what I'm communicating?
I get partial what you say, but I want to first get back what Jordan raised. Yeah, it is true. We've been discussed this many times. I haven't looked at that issue and the PR in detail, but because it's not surprise to me, we have this kind of problem in the past. For the PDB, for me, that's the cluster level of the view for that workload or services, right? So So this is why I think about a lot of terminology is being misused. Like for example, eviction. When we first design, eviction actually is the local decision optimization. Preemption actually is the cluster level of the things. Like the eviction, when I decided evicted, it's like when the node resource starvation, or when I like the drain the node, I want to evict all those kind of things, and then claim that node it is ready to be removed, properly removed. But now it's kind of mixed all over the place, and but on that particular PDB issue, we have this kind of problem in the replica side, in the initially. I also have the long discussing with the, back then, even don't have the SIG API, I have the long discussion with the API machinery teams. So on this kind of things, I really think about the lot ready part, it is disruptive. But that's not the decision, our decision is PDB as the controller, their decision, right? It's not our decision. And on the node side, we already marked this part, it is running, ready or not ready, and even have the ready plus states in some extent. So basically PDB, based on that one, they should define the policy or the services availability and make decision how they are going to delete this part. Right? At the end, it is just what's the policy they want to delete. And Kubernetes cannot make that decision because we could see that this part at this given time, due to all those problems, due to all those kind of available resources, it is in crash loop. And so we mark that it's not ready, but it is, we admit at Kubernetes, we already run it once, succeed, run once, and they are running state. Based on the restart policy, we are keep running that or terminate that, all those things. It is on the cluster level of the controller decided to make the services level availability or whatever availability, they decided what's next step. So that's kind of things we agree upon at the earlier stage of the Kubernetes. I just want to mention here, so I think the terminology is pretty important, and we need to figure out what's that. Then we know what we are talking about here.
So jumping in, not on a terminology thing, but on a concern I would have, Jordan, if we change the eviction logic to be able to evict not ready pods. So one of the things that I've seen, there's been a number of different PRs, I think, that I've reviewed for this. There's a bug on the backlog that states that when you restart a kubelet, a bunch of pods go not ready until the readiness probe has a chance to run. And so is it possible that that sort of behavior could intersect with this, where you restart a kubelet and then all of a sudden a bunch of pods get evicted because now we're allowing us to kick out pods that are not ready? I think there's a lot of things that, like, not ready is not necessarily a good enough signal, I think, to evict a pod on its own. I would say that it has to be an app level consideration. But that's because there's not enough context available in the kubelet to know.
I completely agree with that. And I would like to say that pod disruption budget was the wrong name for this. It should be called application disruption budget. So if you're thinking about disrupting a pod in the context of an application, that's different than thinking about disrupting an individual pod. And my premise is the eviction API should take no action unless it can know for certain that the action it takes will not result in an unhealthy application. If the application's already unhealthy because all the pods are in crash loop or what have you, it should take no action. Kind of like a circuit breaker failing open. Like, you requested this, I'm in an unknown state, I can't proceed. And that will cover these cases where readiness is flapping because the kubelet restarted, or the kubelet might be going unreachable temporarily, or if the pod was restarted for some reason. Readiness can be quite transient. And I think this is primarily targeted around like automated behavior. So trying to drain a node and then remove it from the cluster in an automated way. Because obviously if you're sitting at the keyboard and drain fails, it's not a big deal. You can kind of work through that quite quickly. But if you want a system that is constantly maintaining itself, you need this logic to account for lots of different scenarios. And so I think what we're talking about here is preserving applications that are in like a unknown state, because we don't really have an application level signal. Not all applications are behind services. So just because a pod is labeled as not ready doesn't mean it's not doing useful work, especially if the node is unreachable. And it also doesn't mean that there won't be data loss if we were to remove that pod. And that's the point I made on the list regarding our use of etcd and OpenShift. We use these canary pods because we run etcd as a static pod, and you can't drain them anyway. So if we were to have a condition where those pods went unready for whatever reason, maybe there's a bug that we wrote in that canary pod definition, or any number of things, that would allow then all of those nodes to be deleted in an automated way. And that's pretty much what we're trying to prevent.
So there are a few things that I'm trying to reconcile. The first is that we already allow deletion of not ready pods in some cases. So the idea that eviction can guarantee, like the gate on eviction can guarantee applications remain healthy, like that's already not safe. So if you're depending on PDBs to like
I disagree.
Data loss or something like that, like PDBs are the wrong tool for that today with the behavior in master.
They are a tool. They're not the only tool, but they do absolutely prevent from involuntary, prevent voluntary disruption. So there's always going to be a race between involuntary and voluntary, right? If I want to evict a pod and then all of a sudden another node crashes and a different pod's impacted, there's nothing we can do to prevent that ever, because that crash could happen before, right before, or right after. That's just what's going to happen. But if we have a reasonable level of certainty that the data we do have is accurate, we should be able to make good decisions with that data.
Yeah, I think the exceptional cases that would be like a node crashes and then another node crashes and then a controller goes bananas and is like deleting everything. Like those exceptional cases are exactly the types of cases where we don't actually have great confidence that the data in the PDB is accurate. Like if the disruption controller isn't keeping up updating status and we're like, I don't know, looks like I had 3 healthy things and I only wanted 2 and all of these are not ready. So cool, delete, delete, delete. Like that happens today. So I'm trying to reconcile like the use of PDBs this way with the current behavior we have. I think so that's something I'm trying to figure out. The other is that for the controller to use readiness as a signal for like the status number of healthy pods, but for the API server not to use that seems confusing to me.
Jordan, I totally agree with you. There's the unexpected event. The problem it is, like I also agree with Michael, those unexpected events, Kubernetes at the node level, we cannot predict, right? Even Kubernetes don't know it itself will be done, crashed together with node. So all can do it is the data to generate when it is node is available, generate available data. And then there's the way to detect in the class level, to detect network partition, detect of the crash load. So those kind of information should be collected, which is kind of what we have like the node timestamp, right? Send the status timestamp. This is what we are trying to do. So then PDB or other controller based on that one to make a decision. So they cannot just based on the pod readiness or single status. They need to take other status into this controller and to see. This kind of debate is in the job controller and also the replica side. I've been debated many times. It's just whereas as the node level, what we can do, it is just management of the node level of the device resource and everything. So we make our decision to option admit of those, but we give the data. Feedback loop is pretty important here. So I just don't.
I guess I'm like, we tell people to use Drain as a tool for managing nodes, but it's pretty trivial to deadlock it in a way that, like, you look at the nodes, or not the nodes, you look at the pods, and they're not healthy, and they're not available, and until they're deleted, the replacements can't be spawned. But you can't use the tooling built on the API we told people to use because we're blocking it based on this deadlock. So
yeah, you end up
I
in a
don't
situation
have a
where you have
strong
to force
opinion about
delete the
resolving
pods.
it this way, but it seems like that deadlock has to be resolved some way. Because if you can't use automated tooling built on this, it's not useful.
We have resolved the deadlock if you only are attempting to evict an unready pod and you have enough ready pods covered by that PDB. Eviction checks that today. So if you lose one node and there's only one replica, right, and we have properly tuned, highly available workloads, right, that node can be successfully drained today, no problem. And I think the concern is, okay, if the disruption controller has crashed, right, that's an oversight that I hadn't previously considered, because that logic today is if those counts are never updating how many available replicas, and then we go boom, boom, boom and delete 3 pods, we should definitely close that gap. And that seems like we could put just like something in a status field, like just something that needs to be popped. So the disruption controller does the popping, and the eviction does the pushing. So the eviction won't be able to complete that request unless that field is empty. And that field is only emptied by the disruption controller, etc. That's one idea. But definitely, there's no deadlock today if you don't have multiple node failures. If you have multiple node failures, then I don't know if anything can help in that scenario.
Well, I think the claim is that if you have multiple node failures, like your application is already disrupted. Like this bit is not doing the disruption. The disruption already happened, and this is what's going to unblock automatically recovering from it. That's why I think the fundamental question is a not ready pod already disrupted or not? Like to me, that's kind of the primary question. And if we don't consider it to already be disrupted, then a lot of what is being discussed here makes sense. If we do consider it to already be disrupted, then eviction, like PDB, shouldn't have an opinion about it at that point.
I think if we could, if readiness status happened immediately, and as soon as a pod came online and magically it was just running and ready, then we could definitely say that. But because pods can get restarted, kublets can go unreachable, then there's a very large, time period where pods can be running, the API status can be incorrect, but because it's unready in the API, we're saying we're going to delete this and check nothing else. I think that's the wrong decision.
I think the most of the time it is not ready. I realize our intent it is here. It is like the not ready, but not ready could mean like the Kubernetes restart immediately later back to the ready, right? Could be like the crash loop, and we back off, and the Kubernetes will for a long time not restart that, and it's totally disruptive to me on that state. Yeah. If we are talking about the application level availability. So I think that's the missing signal for the PDB, because when they only look at the ready or not ready without more detail, like how many since this crash, like the initial crash, and now how many restart, how many retry, those restart count. Yeah, so that
there's some chat happening in the text chat, and I just wanted to address one of the things that was written in there, because I mentioned we have this bug. There is another bug that was filed as a bug. I don't actually think it's a bug, but there was a bug filed against us talking about, well, you know, if you restart a kubelet, then pods show as not ready. And so that's the sort of thing that we need to consider here. Like, not ready doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with the pod. I don't think that we can always assume that like we need more context in order to be able to evaluate if something is actually disrupted or not. Because like, I don't think it's safe for like, it would be a very big change in expectations for users to change the default of, oh yeah, we just assume the pods are ready unless proven otherwise. To me, that doesn't seem like a safe default. We should assume that the pods are not ready until proven otherwise, I think, which is the current behavior. So that was filed as a bug against us. So David had a comment like, that seems like that bug that we should fix. I don't think we should fix it because I don't actually think it's a bug. I think it's just a mismatch in expectations. Similarly with this bug, a lot of the folks on the issue are saying things like, well, but like a pod that's in crash looping, it's already dead. Like, it's, you know, I consider it terminated. Well, a kubelet doesn't consider it terminated. And there could be any number of reasons. Like, if it's crash looping, sure, that's probably disrupted. But if we're just looking at not ready, there could be any number of reasons why it's not ready. It could just be that there was some issue with, like, you know, the readiness probe flaked or something like that. So I don't want people to be like, okay, it's not ready, definitely disrupted. I don't think that's true, and I don't think that's a bug. And I think that's what you're saying as well.
I really agree with you. This is, again, I keep mentioning that we debate. The replica set the controller when the original implement, they basically have one problem. Particularly, one problem is just like, okay, the pod, it is crash, and then we keep not ready, and then we have like the send or restart count. But the replica side look at not ready only, and then they keep create of the new pod, and they keep create new pod, but they didn't remove previous one. So they end up like the like replica equal to 3, they end up create of like more than 10, but then they have the tons of like the behind, and is in the not ready state, and take off the node of the resource. So those logical, we need the tighten. I just read off the Derek's chat. So we need to tighten off the behavior, and here make that more clear. So yeah, I agree.
So I guess Jordan or David, I don't have any, as I said in the chat, I don't have any disagreement that there's a coherent argument to make that a non-ready pod is potentially already disrupted. What I was trying to figure out was, do we actually feel safe making this change in the community without allowing the ability to fall back to prior behavior? This seems like a tightening without an ability to loosen, which feels risky for a GA API, which is why I was trying to find a word that says like, I can have max scheduled, but not yet terminal pods be treated differently than scheduled, but not yet ready pods, if that makes sense.
I need to see that written out so I can parse it. I broke my brain.
I mean, the tension here is like, do we want to treat not ready pods as disrupted or not? And so basically having the option that allows you to say, I don't care about the readiness state. I only care if the pod had ever started or was in the process of starting. That seems like a use case that might have been missed in the PDB discussion. Some of the other things that Jordan, you raised, I mean, I think I was the one who said PDB should ignore terminal pods. At least we all agree that one was safe. But I think this one, there's reasonable ways to ask, did the PDB provide enough knobs for the ways that people may or may not be using it? To be clear, like I'll put my red hat on right now. I don't think the OpenShift use case that Michael is communicating is a disastrous product posture in any way. And I don't actually feel like the present behavior or even the updated behavior would have a material impact, because if the issue, as we've talked through with Michael, is what happens if you had 2 nodes lost and you've already had a quorum failure, and there's some issues with that independent of this capability. To me, it's more like, can reasonable people be depending on behavior? And is it right to tighten that behavior unexpectedly upon them versus find an alternate path to both support tightening for correctness as well as capture that gray area in between right now?
I would actually consider the current state to be sort of the worst of both worlds, because Drain is vulnerable to deadlocks, and depending on it to handle like not ready pods in a way that doesn't deadlock, is vulnerable to like the controller not running.
But Drain is already vulnerable to deadlocks.
As Michael described, like if we made the not ready handling safer, more correct, then it becomes more vulnerable to deadlocking.
But Drains are already vulnerable to deadlock with stateful sets, right? And these are the exact pods you're most likely to put a PDB around. The stateful set pod won't be deleted until the node said, I have deleted it. And so like, that is the pod you're most likely to put a PDB in front of anyway.
That's actually the entire reason I implemented the check readiness and check PDB counts, was to close a bug related to stateful sets, because they don't get a new replica, or everything else would.
Yeah, I'm not particularly attached to a particular outcome. I just want, if someone is expecting this to be safe for them to use with Drain, I want that expectation to be met. If someone is expecting PDBs to keep disastrous things from happening, I want that expectation to be met. And I don't think either of those are completely true right now. And
I don't see why this needs to be part of eviction. If your organization, you know, whoever, not you specifically, but any organization decides that I don't care about unready pods, delete them. I mean, that is a trivial line to write, right? Step 1, delete anything that's not ready. Step 2, drain, or reverse them if you feel so inclined. I don't see why we would need to put this in eviction specifically.
I think the mismatch between the controller and the server is at best confusing, and at worst opens the door to like mismatches and guaranteed behavior. I just want to see it be coherent. If that means another option on the PDB to say like, what do you do with these things? Then the controller can honor it and the server can honor it. But the mismatch of the two is pretty confusing. It makes the admission code very difficult to reason about.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, like I'm trying to think of other edge cases that might come around PDB with this. And do you feel, Jordan, there's a expectation mismatch on how a replica set would define ready versus how a replica set would define available? And do we want the PDB controller to maybe align how it views available in the same way the replica set views available, which is ready for some min period of seconds? So at least that you avoid flapping.
I haven't thought about it enough to know. I don't know.
That seems like we're working away from more protection. If we're only considering available pods, then that will be like more criteria for the pod to meet before we say don't disrupt it. I think that's
it's possible
the wrong way
too
to
that there's like, we're thinking of these pods as only in 2 categories. Like disrupted or not, safe to evict or not. And it might be, there's like 3 categories. There's like the ones that the controller considers to be able to count in current healthy. And maybe that's actually what we have today implicitly, because the controller considers readiness and the API server doesn't. So maybe we do have 3 categories of pods, but that's just never been formalized. So like safe to evict unconditionally or safe to delete unconditionally is one category. Like perfectly ready and contributing member of society pod is another category. And then there's a middle area where it's like, we don't want to just delete these things. Like they might be doing work, but they're certainly not healthy. Like they're not ready, they're not being routed to by services. Like we don't know what their status is. And that just hasn't been formalized. And so a lot of the code like is basically these binary, like Boolean, good or bad functions.
There's also, there's a 4th category of canary pods. Like specifically, we point out in the documentation, schedule a pod, put PDB, allow disruption 0. And that is basically a proxy for you cannot drain this node successfully. And that could also represent static pod or just be a part of an administrator procedure saying nobody is allowed to get rid of this one particular node or this class of nodes until they contact me. So I think readiness in that scenario is not desirable. We don't ever want that pod to go away.
So I mean, a pod that doesn't define readiness checks like is always ready, right? So if you haven't indicated any readiness, then
unless the pod had to restart or the kubelet went unreachable temporarily or the kubelet restarted.
So and we're not going to resolve it now. I don't want to. We can move on. I think the current state is problematic and confusing, and people are relying on PDBs for things that PDBs can't actually guarantee. And so if a change is needed in PDBs or in the API server or in the controller, that's fine. I don't think like our current state is like, this is pretty much fine. And if someone feels like pushing a big change here, that would make it better. Like there's bugs around deadlocks and there's bugs, latent bugs in the API server implementation that make what some people are apparently depending on not safe. So just want to point that out.
I think it's pretty much 99% there and works great. And it sounds like we identified some small areas where we can fix some of our assumptions, but I think it works perfectly.
Well,
folks, we've been discussing this for a while. We have a couple more items on the agenda. So in order to make sure that they have enough time, I want to, we can maybe table this discussion to next week and move on to those.
Yeah, I totally agree with Alana. Let's move to, Sergey, can you share a doc? Maybe people haven't read that doc yet. I noticed you.
Definitely haven't read it yet. I wanted to just say one thing about it. I can present next time, but what I wanted to say is I think it may be a good idea to send a questionnaire to users to understand what preventing them from from migrating off Dockershim. And I put a questionnaire at the end of the document. So if you have an opinion what question to ask, please comment there. And next week I can present more.
Sounds good.
Okay, and finally, last one is Polly.
Okay, so short introduction because I'm new to this group here. I've been doing most of my work in SIG storage. Recently, I started looking at the structured logging effort, and I'm helping out there. I'm also maintaining some of the upstream projects together with Tim Hockin. And I noticed while doing that a few things have been pending in the SIG Node area. It starts with the kubelet flags that refer to config files or that have a corresponding entry in the config file for kubelet. I think the deprecation remark is now several years old, and I was just wondering whether there is still a plan in place to actually remove the parameters, because eventually I might add one more to the list that will be basically deprecated from the beginning. And I was wondering what the status is here. Does anyone know?
So we're clearly working on some flags migration. So there are a couple PRs currently in flight. I don't know what the status of overall process is. I think at some point there was like a single issue tracking all the deprecations, and like there were like separate issues, and we created a single issue that tracking all the migration.
Okay.
Yeah, we also been discovering, I think, sort of piecemeal at this point. There are some things that have flags that are lacking a corresponding kubelet configuration value. So I think as we've seen this come up, we've been filing issues to add them to the kubelet configuration, because those probably need to all be done individually as separate changes. If they're already in the kubelet configuration, there's no API change and review required. But if it isn't there already, then we do need to do that. Hence the sort of like, we have a mega issue for one deprecations versus there's these things we need to add, and each has to kind of go through review separately. So I know that is ongoing because I keep triaging new issues that are like, oh, this thing is missing. It's only available in a flag. So.
Yeah. No, I was thinking of those things that already have a config entry and still have command line flags. So those command line flags are basically obsolete now and need to be or can be removed at some point. But yeah, okay. But
yeah, from an operations perspective, it's very disruptive to remove command line flags without like some sort of deprecation period. So we'd have to follow the standard deprecation cycle. I'm trying to find this in the minutes because this was previously raised in SIG Node, I think a couple of months ago, discussing like, should we put resources into this deprecation and whatnot? And I think the ultimate conclusion was working group component base. I mean, I think that's now dissolved because there was no active leadership there. So like that working group had lost momentum and other SIGs weren't actually doing migrations. So given everything that's also in the air at SIG Node, we didn't want to prioritize doing a refactor that nobody else was doing.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, coming from that as an outsider, the flags were already marked as deprecated in the command line at least 4 years ago. I don't know whether that officially started the deprecation period. That was probably a different discussion. But anyway, it's not that important. It was mostly around what do I do about the new things. Let's continue with that part. So I was looking at the logging part of the current kubelet configuration, and I noticed that the V1 beta is the version for the overall config, but it embeds a V1 alpha for the logging configuration. So my take is that this logging part is still alpha, because that's what the type says, and there's just a missing comment. So the users do not necessarily see that they are using something that is actually still alpha. And I was wondering whether that is also the opinion of everyone else here in the group, because then if it is, then I can create a PR that just adds a comment to the documentation that's saying that the logging field or the logging part of the configuration is alpha.
I think I'd actually made a comment about this when it went in. Maybe at the time it was part of an alpha feature. From my perspective, if there's a struct that's used in a beta config API, it should be at beta level stability. So I would encourage like creating a beta package under component config and like having the logging structs there and having people reference the beta types. Like from a user's perspective, they're not going to thank us if they wrote a beta config file and then we like do something breaking over a single release and we're like, oh, but this substruct was alpha, didn't you know? Like no one will thank us.
I agree that it's suboptimal, but this is what we currently have, and I'm not sure. I need to talk with the folks in the structured logging working group whether they are ready to commit to a beta version of the logging configuration. That is the bigger question. And yeah, I'm planning.
Surely you've read there's a cap that was reviewed and approved this cycle for deprecation of most of those flags.
I'm working on the implementation of that cap exactly. And
I would say unless use of that is guarded behind like an alpha flag or something, like they've already signed up for beta stability. It's in a beta config file.
It currently has fields that are unquestionable. It's the logging format, and well, I know the other field is actually, I think, is actually experimental. Let me see whether I can have it readily available. Just a second.
Yeah, like I reviewed this cap. I know that there was talk of adding a new field and a new command line flag. I don't know, like it hasn't gone through API review yet, I don't think. It looked quite straightforward to me as a cap reviewer, so I wasn't like a stickler of like.
Yeah, no, the cap is mostly about the Klog flags, and they are not in that config file, so you're safe there.
Yes.
Yeah, I recall it being kept very small, like very constrained.
Yeah.
Intentionally.
The sanitize option, that is experimental. So the sanitize flag for removing secrets or something like that, that is part of logging configuration.
Yeah, and I think if that doesn't get graduated by next release, it should be ripped out because it's alpha.
Yeah.
And it's been sitting in alpha for like 4 releases.
Okay. So that puts it a bit into perspective. So let's talk about the things that I'm currently planning. Deprecating the Klog flags is certainly one of them. I'm not even sure whether that affects kubelet or even needs approval from SIG Node particularly, because it's mostly just in component base, and I think kubelet will just inherit that without any changes. So that might be fine. The more interesting one is around replacing support for different output streams. That is part of a cap. We have that feature currently for plain text. So you could configure Klog to write to different files and then process those files at different priorities. And one of the agreements as part of adopting the cap for deprecating Klog was that a similar feature should be possible for JSON output. And long-term also, of course, for traditional plain text, perhaps. But that means we need to have that feature for the JSON output in the first place, because currently it doesn't exist, and that means making it configurable somehow. And my plan for that is to have new options underneath the currently v1 alpha logging configuration for the JSON format. One is a Boolean split stream that just says write info to standard out and error message to standard error. And then that can be consumed separately. And there's also one thing that I planned for buffering, which was a feature request from SIG Scalability, that there should be a possibility to have an in-memory buffer and not write out everything at once or immediately, but rather do it in batches. So these are 2 new options that I need to put into that config file, and they will appear in that logging configuration.
That sounds good. We are currently over time, so I think we need to wrap up the meeting.
So I guess that will need an API review. We can talk about it more when it's ready. I'm currently in the process with Tim Hawkin to actually rewrite some of a part of a command line parsing. And once that PR is in, we can come back to those that I just mentioned. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.